Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 719. Today is November 27th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today, returning to the show is our co-host, Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you back on here today. And we got some news that you're going to catch us up on today. And before we get into the content, just want to give people a quick reminder to check out my new show, The Kyle Anzalone Show, and subscribe to it on YouTube. The link to it is right at the top of the show notes page for this episode. So it's very easy to head on over. Just click over real quick and go ahead and subscribe to that show. Before you forget, I really appreciate it if you could do that. And Connor, let's get into it today. The first article I have, well, basically the first thing I have to ask you about today is just what is going on in Gaza. We've kind of talked about more big picture stuff on the show over the last week and a half. What's going on with the ethnic cleansing of the northern half of the Gaza Strip, but there's also a lot happening just day to day. The bombs are raining down on the people. So what are the people of Gaza suffering under right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the ethnic cleansing campaign, the general's plan put forward by the retired Major General Giora Island, is still being implemented in northern Gaza, in areas like Gaza City, Bet Lahia, Jabalia. These have all been under siege since the beginning of October. And they're bombing. We saw shelling on the Kamal Adwan hospital again. I believe also at the Indonesian hospital. In fact, the director of one of the hospitals was injured by the shelling. We've seen civilians just being massacred at a ridiculous rate. Over the past weekend, we saw 172 people killed just over the course of 3 days. And they're bombing the north relentlessly, but at the same time, they're still bombing the Nusriat refugee camp in central Gaza, as well as Rafah in the south. As Dave DeCamp lays out in his article here, Gaza's Civil Defense Agency reported yesterday that 22 Palestinians have been killed on Tuesday. The daily death toll update, which comes around noon local time, reported that there were 14 Palestinians killed and about 108 wounded. As usual, the announcement from the Gaza Health Ministry is that the civil defense crews cannot reach all the people that have been killed because either they're buried under the rubble, and we really don't know. That number, 10,000, has hovered there since November of last year, really. And unfortunately, we're talking about 40 million tons of rubble, at least according to the UN, in Gaza right now. So I presume that those numbers are really way ahead of 10,000. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people.
There was an article this week from Gideon Levy from Haaretz, Connor, that said he had a source inside Gaza. And of course, this is a Palestinian, so the number might be a little bit exaggerated. But he said that he thought there were tens of thousands of people under the rubble in northern Gaza alone, and hundreds of thousands when it came to the entire strip. And certainly with some of the Israeli policies like the kill zones, I wouldn't be surprised that the numbers are certainly in the upper five figures as far as people who are dead somewhere under the rubble of Gaza. The only real question is, will they ever be counted? But go ahead.
No, absolutely. I wouldn't be surprised. We just saw from Haaretz recently that Jabalia has been destroyed, and this is formerly the largest refugee camp in all of Gaza, and it's been attacked, relentlessly and brutally since October of last year. There was that infamous instance where they killed well over 100 people in a bombing attack, attempting to get one anti-tank commander of Hamas, allegedly, who was, supposedly hiding in a tunnel below the ground. And famously, Wolf Blitzer interviewed the IDF spokesman at the time, who now works for the Foundation of Defensive Democracies, and said to him, "Did you get the commander?" And he goes, "We really don't know, Wolf." And even Wolf Blitzer, who walked right off of APAC into his job at CNN, was taken aback by that. But we've also seen reports from Haaretz where they are just leveling every last bit of infrastructure, every last home, every last residential building, so that the Palestinians have absolutely nothing to return to. And that really was indicative of the general's plan, which is to put northern Gaza under a complete siege, prevent any food, water, medicine, and other aid from getting in, declare it a closed-off military zone. They tell these people to evacuate, even though they bomb them along the evacuation routes, men, women, and children. And then whoever stayed there, who's ever still there beyond a certain point, when they know that there's no safe place to go throughout the Strip, will be exterminated. And this is completely out in the open and reported in mainstream news in Israel. Particularly the Israeli media is much less cagey about it. But it's very out in the open that this is strictly speaking, an ethnic cleansing, a genocide by any definition, any standard. But as Dave lays out here, more specifically, we had attacks on Tuesday on a school sheltering displaced Palestinians in the Zaytun neighborhood in Gaza City. 11 Palestinians were killed in that attack, and over 40 were wounded. In Jabalia, 7 people were killed and others were wounded in a strike on a residential building. In Bet Lahia, at least 1 person was killed by an Israeli strike. They also, as I said, bombed the central Gaza as well as the south, killing 2 in the Nusayrat refugee camp and 1 in Rafah. The official death toll from the Gaza Health Ministry is now over 44,249 Palestinians. The number of wounded has reached 104,746. We know from the team of 99 American doctors who spent a combined 257 weeks in Gaza a combined 257 days in Gaza, that the death toll is at least 118,000, I believe 908. But that's the lowest estimate that they can come up with the available data. And, they're talking about tens of thousands of people who have been starved to death from the Israeli siege. And so, as you were pointing out earlier, Kyle, I mean, the real death toll here, I've assumed for a while now that if you take that number, 118,000, and then add the number of wounded, you get something that's a closer approximation of what we're looking at. But even that would still be an undercount. I mean, you would be talking about, 104,000. You're talking about 225,000 or so people killed and wounded so far. But obviously, that does not include the Palestinians who are buried under the rubble. So we're talking about something much, much worse. And we're just, there's no end in sight. We do know that settler leaders like I believe her name is Daniela Weiss, are being taken on tours inside Gaza, and she's saying that they have hundreds of families ready to move in at the drop of a hat to go in and take up their posts and build settlements in the Netzarim corridor and other areas that are occupied by the Israeli military right now. And what they're really talking about is a permanent military occupation and moving in, as Bezalel Smotrich was talking about recently in the article you wrote for the Institute. They see Donald Trump coming in as really their ticket to resettling Gaza. And he's saying within, I believe, a matter of 2 years, they can reduce the population in Gaza by about 1 million. We really don't know how many people are still alive in Gaza, but before the genocide took place, there were about 2.3 million people living inside the Strip, half of which were children. So they're talking about ethnically cleansing at least 1 million people and moving in, probably a similar number of Israelis if they can. And they're just going to continue to drive these people out. And I don't know what the future really holds for the Palestinians, because every piece of land that they have has been destroyed. I mean, all the agriculture, all their homes, as I said, we've seen just, so many of the schools. I mean, all the universities have been destroyed. Nearly all the hospitals have been destroyed. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of mosques obliterated, as well as churches. Every last bit of, cultural their cultural sites are being just eviscerated, cemeteries dug up. I mean, this is truly and ethnic cleansing doesn't even really it's not really the right word to use. I mean, they're wiping this nation off the map. We always hear the threat that the propaganda that Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map, and that's clearly not true. I mean, they're taking so much of the Israeli aggression and hostility and attacks on the Chin, and being pretty restrained in their responses. But the Israelis very clearly are wiping the Palestinians off the map, and the American people are paying for it.
Well, let's talk about the starvation campaign, Connor, because you have this article that you tweeted out from Common Dreams. Israeli siege leaves 130,000 kids trapped and at risk of starvation in northern Gaza. And so we know the siege has been on of northern Gaza since the start of October, but what's the latest and how bad has the situation gotten there?
Yeah, so this is very important article from Common Dreams by Lise Goldsmith, and this is about a report from Save the Children, which says that an estimated 130,000 children under the age of 10 are trapped in northern Gaza, entirely cut off from any sort of aid assistance, food and medical supplies, and this has gone on for 50 days. The life-saving aid has largely failed to make it through to any of the people besieged by the Israeli forces in northern Gaza, and the IDF has declared the territory a dangerous military zone. As I mentioned earlier, we have Joyce Musha, the acting Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator for the UN, warning that the Israeli offensive in the area has become an intensified, extreme, and accelerated version of all the horrors we've seen over the last year. And local health officials in Gaza say that the death toll for the entire enclave, as I said, has now surpassed 44,000. Save the Children has been unable to access northern Gaza to deliver food for 5,000 families, along with 725 hygiene kits and other aid supplies for over 7 weeks, the group said in its statement on Monday this week. They say beyond the area before the area was closed off, Save the Children worked through local partners to reach thousands of children in need, distributing over 1,000 food parcels and 600 hygiene kits, and reaching around 15,000 children and families in northern Gaza with psychosocial support, recreational activities, and case management. But Save the Children's warning comes not long after the Famine Review Committee released an alert stating that there's a strong likelihood that famine is imminent in areas within the northern Gaza Strip. And we've been hearing that for months and months and months, especially since the beginning of the year. And these warnings really ticked up over the summer. But, one of the reasons why they have continued to say famine is imminent is because the humanitarian workers, because of the way the war is being conducted with bombs being dropped constantly in the north of Gaza, central Gaza, and southern Gaza, these humanitarians are not able to get in there and actually determine whether or not famine is actually taking place. But we know from those doctors that they estimate that tens of thousands of people, based on their observations and the data they've collected, are starving to death. And we have seen reports of children starving to death, babies dying shortly after they've been born because they can't be fed, because the mothers cannot produce breast milk as a result of the malnutrition. We know that so many children are dying. They say a mother of 2 trapped in northern Gaza, identified by Save the Children as Ruba, testified through the group that she was trapped with her children, quote, under relentless bombs, rockets, and bullets with nowhere to run. She says, my mother is paralyzed and I cannot leave her behind. My brother has been killed. My husband was taken and I don't know if he's alive. With no food, no clean water, and constant fear, both my children have developed rashes and my daughter is passing blood, but there is no medicine, no help, and absolutely nothing I can do. They cry and ask me why we just can't leave, why their father isn't with us, and why we can't go back to a normal life. And so Save the Children, they mention here, Eloise mentions here, is not the only entity reporting that aid is being blocked. According to an update from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs issued last week regarding northern Gaza, they say between November 1st and the 18th, 27 out of 31 coordination requests by the UN to access the besieged areas were denied, and the remaining 4 were initially approved but then impeded on the ground. No fuel was let in for water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities. And of course, this all comes amid, floods, during the winter, where we just saw an incident recently where in one of the refugee camps, 10,000 tents were just completely washed away. And the water supplies have been hit so consistently that there are now floods from the sewage system, which is going to spread more and more diseases, as we've already seen polio reappearing in Gaza as a result of the war strategy, which really emulates what we've seen in the past in Iraq after the first Iraq war and in Yemen as well, where essentially this country is put under, or in this case, the Gaza concentration camp is put under a full blockade. And then all the infrastructure, particularly the water systems and the sewage systems, are targeted with bombs so that these diseases, there's no clean drinking water for these people to access. And so they end up basically to stay hydrated, they're drinking poison water. And so people are getting caught up with polio and all these other diseases that are spreading. And that's really the intent of the strategy, as we saw in Iraq during the sanctions campaign, during the Bill Clinton years, where they prevented chlorine and other, easily attainable medicines from getting into the country, because they want people to die. They want the civilian population to be punished so they can put pressure on them, ostensibly so that they overthrow their government when they're in a much more weakened position than they otherwise would be. But all that does, of course, is it ensures that there's going to be more support, in this case for Hamas, which is the only real, besides some of the other resistance groups in the Strip, the only armed defense militia, the only militia they can rely on for any sort of armed defense. But obviously, they're not really able to protect any of the Palestinian people there in Gaza. It's just been a massive slaughter campaign. And that's why all the propagandists backing this war have to frame it as it's a war on Hamas when it's actually a genocide against the Palestinian people. And I just would add that there was a recent report from the UN that talked about how 70% of the victims of this war so far are women and children, and that the primary age demographic of the Palestinians that are being murdered are between the ages of 5 and 9 years old. So this is a war on children that Israel is carrying out. And this next story from the Cradle is about how they are continuing. This is another report from the UN. Israel has outright denied 90% of aid deliveries to North Gaza. So Israel outright denied 82 out of 91 attempts since October 26 to deliver aid to besieged areas in northern Gaza, said Georgios Petropoulos, the head of the UN humanitarian office in Gaza. More attempts were unsuccessful because of, quote, denials of specific locations or specific supplies. He said this in a statement reported by the Washington Post on November 26. The aid that has reached Gaza is being looted by criminal gangs, as we've been hearing in recent weeks, which are able to operate freely because Israel began killing members of the Gaza police forces attempting to secure aid deliveries earlier this year. Petropoulos told the BBC it's tactical, systematic, criminal looting. He says this is leading to ultra-violence from the looters toward the truckers, from the IDF toward the police, and from the police toward the looters. Hamas's security control has dropped to under 20%, the former head of Hamas police investigations told the BBC. He said, we are working on a plan to restore control to 60% within a month. But the BBC was told that thefts often happen in clear sight of Israeli soldiers or surveillance drones, and the army fails to intervene. Stolen goods are apparently being stored outside or in warehouses in areas under Israeli military control, and presumably they're just spoiling there. As a result, hunger and malnutrition among Palestinians is increasing. A Gaza resident named Ahmed told the BBC, my children are very hungry every day. We cannot afford the basics. It's constant suffering. No food, no water, no cleaning products, nothing. We don't want much, just to live a decent life. We need food. We need goods to come in and be distributed fairly. That's all we're asking for. But of course, that's not taking place. And we do know, one of the most shocking revelations that's come out of this war so far, in addition to the mass torture of Palestinians being kidnapped out of Gaza, is that children in the meantime are being sniped on a daily basis by Israeli snipers with headshots. All those American doctors who wrote those open letters to the White House say that they saw multiple children coming into these hospitals and health facilities with bullets in their head every day. And these are toddlers. So this is, unfortunately, this is the war that, our incoming president has championed, and that the incumbents have been fueling this entire time since October 7th. And there is no, even though we have this new ceasefire in Lebanon, they're saying that they're going to double down on their so-called sacred mission in Gaza. And clearly it's to eliminate the Palestinian population there, nearly, maybe even entirely, but certainly to make way for these settlers to come in and take their land. It's just completely overt genocide. And as we can see from the UN, these kinds of things, we just saw the U.S. veto another ceasefire resolution at the Security Council. And there's no, even though Benjamin Netanyahu and the former defense minister Yoav Gallant are now wanted war criminals around the world, the American government is only focused on punishing the International Criminal Court for that, instead of trying to find a way to refurbish to whatever degree possible America's standing in the world for underwriting every last murder of every last child, man, and woman in the Gaza Strip.
So, Connor, one of the, probably world's longest military campaigns that's going on right now and nobody talks about is Israel's bombing campaign of Syria. It's been daily, weekly, probably bi-weekly, maybe on average for a dozen years or so. Israel has been bombing Syria, always claiming to hit Hezbollah, Iran, Shia militias, but, effectively deterring the army of Bashar al-Assad and, in that way empowering the jihadist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So what's the latest on Israel's bombing campaign, or I guess in this case, the U.S. bombing campaign in Syria?
Yeah, the U.S. bombing campaign in Syria has picked up quite a bit this week. CENTCOM just announced that they bombed Syria for the third time this month. And as you mentioned, one of the recent Israeli strikes in the ancient city of Palmyra killed over 100 Syrians, over 100 civilians. And it's apparently the deadliest strike that Israel has carried out in Syria. But yes, they've been bombing Syria relentlessly. We've been covering it on the show for years now. But really, since the dirty war was launched against Damascus, where the CIA, along with their Saudi, Turkish, Qatari, Israeli, and British and French allies, worked to arm and fund al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and basically in an attempt to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Now, that failed, but 500,000 people got killed. And ever since then, the U.S., in an effort to take down the Islamic State Caliphate, which they helped to build with that strategy, they now occupy still a third of Syria, stealing the people's oil and wheat resources in this impoverished country. Because of the Caesar Act sanctions, 90% of the population lives below the poverty line with limited access to food, water, medicine, fuel, and cooking oil, and every other basic necessity. But yes, we still have American troops there, about 900 at least, who are tripwires for escalations with Iran, and certainly the Shiite militias, who are still not nearly as much as they were before the incident at the end of February, or the end of January, excuse me, when Tower 22 was struck, the secretive base on the border with Jordan. But they are still attacking these illegal occupation bases that the Americans have in eastern Syria. And so apparently this was a response to one of those attacks. So Dave DeCamp writes here, and this is from yesterday, the U.S. military announced on Tuesday that it launched a strike in Syria against an Iran-aligned target, marking at least the third time this month that the U.S. has bombed Syria. U.S. Central Command said the strike targeted a, quote, Iranian-aligned militia weapons storage facility, referring to the Shia militias operating in Syria. The command said the bombing came after a U.S. base in Syria came under attack. Now, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is usually biased against Damascus, and they're based in the UK. But they reported the strike, saying U.S. forces based at the Al-Amar oil field in eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor province launched missiles at positions of Iran-backed militias, and they didn't report any casualties in the strike. But a day earlier, reports said that a U.S. occupation base at al-Shahadi in the northeastern Hasaka province came under attack. And there were no reports of U.S. casualties. It's unclear what damage was incurred. But earlier this month, the U.S. launched 2 rounds of strikes against the Shia militias, and the Syrian Observatory said 9 militia members were killed in the 2 bombings, but those numbers haven't been confirmed. And of course, Dave notes here that the 2,500 U.S. soldiers who are still in Iraq, and even though they made that deal with Baghdad to basically end the U.S.-backed coalition's mission there, in the fall of next year, there's really no plans to take the troops out of Iraq. And they're there actually supporting the illegal occupation of Syria as well. which only, again, puts these American troops in the crosshairs of these Shiite militias that are either a part of the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq or a part of these militias that are operating in Syria. And so, as Dave notes, from October 2023 until February this year, the bases in Iraq and Syria came under attack from rocket and drone strikes hundreds of times. And then, as I said, after the incident at Tower 22, Baghdad and Tehran leaned on the militias to get them to wind those attacks down. And they stopped for a bit, but now they're picking up again. And again, this is all a result of the U.S. backing of the genocide in Gaza and these other attacks against the Palestinians. I mean, this is why the Houthis have been attacking American shipping and as well as Israeli-linked shipping. And it's why the U.S. launched a whole new war on Yemen, because really what we're looking at here is Israel's enemies in the region are also the fiercest enemies of al-Qaeda. And that there's a lot of reasons for that. But one, as I mentioned, Israel supports al-Qaeda in Syria. And, they recently did bomb Syrian Arab army positions in the Idlib province, who were there. That's basically where all of al-Qaeda has been confined to after all these years of the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah beating back the Islamic State and al-Nusra. They're all in the Idlib province. And so it was interesting to see Israel once again, as they were during the worst years of the war, flying as al-Qaeda's air force. So they used to do that mostly in the southwest of the country near the occupied Golan Heights, but they're now bombing Syrian Arab army positions in Idlib. And this is really the issue that gets to the heart of, what, quite frankly, I hope the American people are beginning to understand, is that, Israel's enemies, the axis of resistance, who really, we're talking, these are not Boy Scouts. These are the Houthis of Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shiite militias of Iraq and Syria, and the Iranians, the IRGC Quds Force in particular. And their enemies are really the Americans in the region, the Israelis, and al-Qaeda. And they are really the only forces actually defending the Palestinians right now. And so as we inch closer and closer to war with Iran, and that may become a much bigger problem with the incoming Trump administration, he's filled these top cabinet positions with severe hawks on Iran. That we are looking at a war simultaneously with all those countries, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and potentially Iran, as I said. But these are all al-Qaeda's worst enemies in the region. These are the same groups, the same military forces that wiped out the Islamic Caliphate, the Islamic State Caliphate. And so any sort of support for Israel beyond Palestine is really whether intentionally or not, is going to give al-Qaeda a massive boost that they really need now, because they've been largely marginalized as a result of what, when finally they were just attacked on all these different sides in Syria. But we could see their reemergence now. In fact, I think there was I need to check out more on this report, but I saw that there was another attack, I believe, from al-Qaeda against Syrian Arab army positions earlier this, I guess today or maybe yesterday. But this is going to be a further consequence of the U.S. campaign against all of Israel and al-Qaeda's enemies. Now, again, we're talking about what these Shiite militias are going to do in the wake of the ceasefire in Lebanon, which is basically, this is we don't really know how much if this is going to work, but basically this is a U.S. brokered deal for 60 days. A ceasefire between Hezbollah and the Israelis. And the idea is that that Hezbollah is going to take their armed forces back north of the Litani River, and that the Lebanese army is going to move into southern Lebanon as a buffer between Israel and Hezbollah. And then Israel is supposed to withdraw their ground troops from southern Lebanon back into Israel. And they do want to maintain the ability to bomb Lebanon virtually whenever they want, but they have to report, quote, suspicious activity, according to U.S. officials, to a U.S.-led committee, and then they will forward that information to the Lebanese military. And then the caveat is if the Lebanese military doesn't act on those reports, then the Israelis will go back and start bombing again. But you know, the genocide in Gaza is going to continue apace, as well as the attacks on the Palestinians in the West Bank and settlement expansion and the bombings of Yemen, the bombings of Syria. And we've heard from Tel Aviv that they're going to use this period of a drawing down of tensions with Hezbollah to focus more on the Iranian threat, as they put it. Well, the Iraqi Shia militias are saying they're still going to be attacking Israel. So this is this new piece from the Cradle. Sources within the Islamic resistance in Iraq confirm that armed factions will continue attacks against Israel in support of the Palestinians in Gaza. Quote, the leaders of the Iraqi Resistance Coordination Committee held an important meeting and agreed during the meeting to continue attacks via drone and develop missiles against Israel during the next stage, even after the ceasefire in Lebanon. Shafaq news agency reported on November 27th, citing their sources within the Islamic resistance. Now, according to an unnamed source, the agreement was reached between the leaders of the Al-Nujaba movement, Khatib Hezbollah, and the Sayyid al-Shuhada brigades and the Ansar Allah al-Awifa movement, all factions belonging to the IRI umbrella group. So the operations will continue, quote, until the Israeli aggression on Gaza is completely stopped. The factions say, adding they do not care about any Israeli threat. The spokesman for the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Major General Yahya Rasool, recently confirmed that Iraqi security forces are, quote, on high alert and ready to defend the country's sovereignty in response to threats lobbied by Israeli leaders. Quote, the reality is that there is a tangible threat, so Iraq must not be pushed into war. These matters are explained in detail to political leaders and faction leaders, with the prime minister providing detailed explanations about the risks of acting against any country from Iraqi territory. Foreign Minister Fahd Hussein said last week. The Israeli threats came officially through Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar, who sent a letter to the president of the UN Security Council urging immediate action to confront the activities of armed groups loyal to Iran and Iraq. According to officials from parties affiliated with the IRI and the anti-terror popular mobilization units, Washington is exerting strong pressure on Israel to prevent any response to Islamic resistance attacks in support of the Palestinian and Lebanese people. The U.S. Army has also stepped up surveillance along the Iraq-Syria border to track the movement of these IRI factions. Kurdish allies of Washington and Syria were earlier this year accused of releasing hundreds of ISIS fighters on the border region with Iraq. So and again, this is another problem we have with the Israeli aggressions and attacks on Iran, because those strikes that were launched last month in Iran were carried out from Iraqi airspace, which, the militias in Iraq were livid as a result of this, and they want to respond. And so Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani is under a lot of pressure and has to balance all these different forces and try and keep his country out of further escalation. But of course, the U.S. is refusing to leave his country, and they're always going to be caught up in this crossfire between the Israelis and the Iranians. And so this is just another massive powder keg waiting to blow. But again, like the Houthis, the Iraqi Shia militias will not relent in their retaliatory attacks on behalf of the Palestinians against the Israelis as they're butchering these people in Gaza on a daily basis. And so unless the Americans, and there's really no chance of this, especially with Trump coming in. I mean, there was no chance under Biden either. But, unfortunately, this policy is really being determined in Tel Aviv, or at least it appears that way. And so we are going to continue to have this risk of a massive regional war breaking out, which, if it really gets going, will likely dwarf the consequences of the post 9/11 wars, because, this would be a war with at least 5 countries at once. But that's the fire that the American regime is playing with. And there's really no dissent from it in Congress, or nothing that really is substantive or poses any kind of a threat to the status quo right now vis-a-vis U.S. support for the Israelis.
Well, Connor, speaking of playing with fire, we have a real arsonist right here, Lindsey Graham, and you're going to talk about a recent article from Matthew Petty that was published at Reason, Lindsey Graham's bipartisan vision to keep the America in the Middle East forever. And boy, Connor, I just heard him saying yesterday, or a couple days ago, that we need to stay in Ukraine forever because of all the resources. Pretty sure he used to make the same argument about Afghanistan, and now he wants us in the rest of the Middle East forever. So this is absolute insanity, of course, but let us know what this insane warhawk thinks.
Yeah, so this was, Bernie Sanders had introduced these resolutions on blocking certain arms transfers to Israel, which were all voted down by the Senate, in another disgraceful act by our supposed representatives. But what really Lindsey Graham used this as an opportunity to promote his vision for a new Middle East. And this is, it's interesting. He's really highlighting, as Matthew Petty shows here in this piece, the bipartisan consensus and it really reflects this delusion on the part of American policymakers that in the midst of this extermination of the Palestinians, which is, you really couldn't come up with a policy that could, drive more anger and resentment and make war and wide scale war more likely than going ahead and eliminating the Palestinians for the Israeli settler movement. But that is exactly what the Americans are doing. And Lindsey Graham doesn't seem to think that's going to be a problem, because really what he wants to do, and this is what Mike Waltz, the incoming national security advisor on the Trump team, wants to do as well. I mean, they both sound completely crazy. They say that what we need to do is, we can make the deal with Saudi Arabia, even if Biden couldn't pull it off. I know that they wanted initially to expand the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia, and it actually did look like that was a likely possibility, because I believe it was 2 weeks before October 7th, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, told Brett Baer of Fox News that we get closer and closer every day to an agreement. Well, obviously, since the genocide started taking place, that has become almost impossible politically. There's no way that Riyadh can make that deal while this war is ongoing. Now, I would not be surprised if the Saudis went ahead and made a deal with the Israelis once the war is finished. And they would probably say, well, we'll help rebuild Gaza. Of course, the Israelis and the Americans talk about this as if it's, Saudi Arabia's obligation or the rest of the Arab world to rebuild Gaza after the Israelis are done obliterating it and killing hundreds of thousands of people there. But nevertheless, the Biden administration in the sort of lame duck period is focusing on creating a bilateral security deal with Saudi Arabia and bypassing this sticky issue of getting them to normalize Israeli apartheid the way the UAE did, the way Bahrain did, and the way Morocco did. They're going to just try and make a deal with Saudi Arabia, talking about having the sort of the defense commitment, which they've been seeking, which is, akin to the kind of defense commitment we have with Japan and South Korea, where the U.S. would go to war on behalf of Saudi Arabia. And that's what Lindsey Graham is talking about here. They also want increased access to advanced weapons that they don't have yet from the Americans, and assistance in building a civilian nuclear energy program as well. But Lindsey Graham and these guys really believe that they can expand the Abraham Accords and just basically normalize not just Israeli apartheid the way they did during the Trump era, but at this point, Israeli genocide of the Palestinians. But it's just a completely far-fetched idea. He says, what I would like to do is with President Joe Biden before he leaves office is work with President Trump, the incoming president, and President Biden, the outgoing president, to find a solution. Can we lock down a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel that protects Saudi Arabia, a defense agreement with Saudi Arabia so they're in our column and they have an antidote to Iranian aggression? And this is the other part that they really don't seem to understand, is that so the UAE has normalized relations with Iran. Bahrain is poised to do the same thing soon. Kuwait already has. The Sudan has normalized their relations with Iran. And most importantly, last March, China brokered a normalization, a real true peace deal, not like the Abraham Accords, a landmark peace deal between the Saudis and the Iranians. And only recently they were carrying out joint military drills and naval drills. And so this idea that Saudi Arabia is concerned about Iran launching a war against them shows that these people don't really understand the dynamics of the region right now. Now, what they could be, anticipating is that if the U.S. and Israel launch a war against Iran, and you have all these American troops and bases and assets on their territory, remember a lot of those sorties that took off to go and shoot down Iranian drones and ballistic missiles back in April after Israel bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus. A lot of those planes took off from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Now, at the time, those states made clear to the Americans that you are not to launch retaliatory strikes against Iran from our territory. We do not want war with Iran. We have increased economic cooperation with them now, and we don't want to throw that all away for your war strategy right now, or for the Israelis, so they can continue killing the Palestinians with impunity. And in fact, recently, Mohammed bin Salman referred to what Israel is doing as a genocide. And so, it really just seems unlikely that they can get this deal done. But Graham is dead set on it. He compared his vision to the generation plus struggle to reshape Germany and Japan after World War II. He held up photos of the atomic bombings in Japan as an example of what victory took back then. And, Graham is very fond. They especially did this early on in the war in Gaza. Comparing it to Dresden and Hamburg and Cologne and Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and saying that this is what they need to do to the Palestinians in Gaza, is just wipe them out because they're worse than Nazis. And in fact, Petty says that is what Graham said in his speech here. But yeah, he held up pictures and said that this is what we need to do. And he is apparently declared war on the Shiites of the Muslim world. That's 10% of 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, and said that they are committed to exterminating Jews. Well, what's ironic about that is anybody can look this up. Iran has a thriving Jewish community, and has for generations and generations. Those people are very safe. They have no interest in moving to Israel. So that's just another lie. But again, the Shiites form the real heart of the axis of resistance, and they are the only forces that are actually opposing Israel's genocide of the Palestinians, because the Sunni dictatorships in the region are all bought and paid for by the Americans. They're just basically sock puppets. So they don't do anything to oppose Israeli hegemony and these mass killings of the Palestinians. So from the American perspective, what they have to worry about are the Shiites, and particularly since there's such acrimony with Iran, going back to when they overthrew the Shah, the U.S. installed a fascist dictator. And so we've never given up our hatred of the Islamic Republic. But, Graham is really caught up in this fever dream that they can build the new Middle East. And he's bragging about how, Saudi Arabia, women since 2018 are now allowed to drive. And since 2019, women can even leave their homes without a male guardian at all times. And so, as Petty points out, this has been totally legal for a long time in Iran and Palestine and many other states across the Arab and Muslim world. But of course, we always have to celebrate that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, during his genocide in Yemen, where with complete American support, he and Abu Dhabi massacred approximately 400,000 Yemenis. We don't really know exactly how many were killed, but that's the UN estimate. It was at least 377,000 people killed. The vast majority of them were infants and children under 5 years old, because, as I mentioned earlier, these policies and war strategies really resemble what we're seeing in Gaza today. And so, in the midst of all that, they went on this major PR campaign to show that he's this, really forward-thinking guy who's trying to bring Saudi Arabia and his people into the 21st century. And this was celebrated in all the mainline American publications out here and by officials as they were, on an industrial scale, mass murdering men, women, and children in the poorest nation in the Middle East, Yemen. And so Graham says the religious doctrines of the Shiites in charge of Iran compel them to kill all Jews. This is not what Islam teaches Muslims, but they believe it. Petty says Graham's office did not immediately respond to an email asking to clarify if he was talking about all Shiites. He says perhaps the long trips to Saudi Arabia have rubbed off on him, but Saudi school textbooks have come under fire for denigrating Shiites as well as Christians and Jews as enemies of pure Sunni Islam. So they're not exactly this, wonderful society that Graham is saying, that we need to turn the whole Middle East, remake the whole Middle East in Saudi Arabia's image. And he says taking sides in Middle Eastern religious struggles is necessary because Iran and its allies, quote, want to control the region and remake it in their image. So that's the framework about Iran, of course. We hear from all these hawks in either party, right? They always to say that Iran is the source of all the instability, all the war, all the killing, all the terrorism in the Middle East, and they're the problem. And really, we're getting closer and closer to a position where, especially now that you have, John Radcliffe and Mike Waltz, these guys really do believe, and until and Matt Gaetz is not going to be the Attorney General. But, all these Trump allies, they really do believe, or at least they say they do, that Iran is trying to kill Donald Trump. And that is, we heard Trump say that this is a reason we need to talk about, bombing Iran to smithereens, all their major cities. And, Pete Hegseth, after Trump assassinated General Qasem Soleimani and the PMF leader Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis in Baghdad on January 3rd of 2020. He went on Fox News and was saying at the time, Michael Tracy posted the clip on Twitter. People can go look it up. But he was talking about, we need to bomb their nuclear facilities now. We need to bomb their oil facilities. We need to bomb their mosques and their hospitals and their schools, because all Islamists, they use these human shields, and we can't follow international law. These laws were written after World War II are only working against us and not the Islamists. And this guy really, he sees himself as a crusader. He's a religious fundamentalist, but really believes that Iran is the worst enemy of the American people. They need to be taken out. And so, this is a very dangerous, radical administration coming in. I mean, the Biden administration just had an absolutely abysmal policy on Iran, as we've covered all these years now. They had a perfect opportunity to return to the JCPOA, and they completely flubbed it. The Israelis went wild in 2022 with their assassination campaign and escalating all of their sabotage attacks on Iran's nuclear program, especially beginning in 2021, which just further thwarted any sort of attempts at diplomacy with Tehran if the Americans were ever sincere about it, although we know that they weren't, because they were trying to use Trump's sanctions and maximum pressure campaign, which they expanded as leverage to gain further concessions from the Iranians. And it's ultimately led us to this situation where we are today. And the Abraham Accords strategy really was a fig leaf for a NATO-style coalition meant to encircle Iran, or analogous to what we've done with Russia, where you just encircle them with military weaponry. You integrate, as we heard from Michael Kurilla, the head of CENTCOM, to integrate the missile and air defenses of all these Arab states with the Israelis, who are now under CENTCOM since the end of the Trump administration, and build up and prepare for a war with Iran. And these guys are coming in there with the same kind of mentality. And I don't think it's a workable strategy, because the Arab world is no longer interested in that. And I think it's pretty obvious to them who the main cause of instability in the region is, and they don't want a massive war, Iranian missiles landing on their territory, taking out their oil facilities and hitting American bases in their countries. That'd be an absolute disaster, and what it would do to their economy. So there's just, the appetite for war is all in Washington and Tel Aviv. And, people like Lindsey Graham, like I said, are living in a complete fantasy world. But I fear that his vision is shared by much of the hawks coming into this administration. And Donald Trump, frankly, there was a moment, I don't know if you saw this, Kyle, but that he was doing a press conference. And I tried to find this clip the other day and I couldn't. But this was a couple of months, I want to say, maybe 2 months ago or so. But Donald Trump was asked off the cuff by a reporter, would you make a deal with the Ayatollah, like a nuclear deal, or, something to have some sort of rapprochement? And he goes, yeah, why not? They could not have nuclear weapons. I wouldn't go back to the JCPOA. So he doesn't know what the JCPOA is after all this time, apparently, because this was
it's completely unsurprising, right, Connor, that that's the situation, that Trump he never got it from the beginning. And I forget who I was listening to recently. They were talking about Donald Trump saying that he wouldn't read the Project 2025 document. And they laughed and they said, of course he would never read that. He doesn't read anything. And, that's one of the problems with Donald Trump. But that's where we should wrap it up, Connor. Thank you so much for all of your analysis on today's show. And we'll have you back on again soon.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.